I want to begin with a story though. Although it's about celebrating what we are doing, I want to begin with a story first. And this story is a story of Craig. Craig was a prac teacher doing his final year of teaching training on his ATP, where you spend a whole term in the classroom. And the last thing that Craig had been sat through before he went out into teaching prac was this protective behaviours, child-safe environments preparation, about the importance of professional distance, the type of relationship that we're called to be in with young people in our care, the obligation, as Teresa said, that we have when we're in that position of responsibility. The session was all about contact with young people, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, whether you can initiate or not. So Craig's there, and it's one of his last days, and his supervisor's in town. His supervisor's in the staff room at lunchtime, and he's out on yard duty, probably getting some extra brownie points by taking on extra yard duty while the fate of his teaching career was being discussed over a cup of tea. And he's on yard duty at lunchtime, and a little kid, 5-6-year-old kid, is running across the quadrangle, and she trips and she falls and she puts out a hand on a really rough bitumen, the old style bitumen that young people wouldn't know about, or us, you get bits of gravel stuck in your hand, and it burns like hell. And she leaps to her feet and she starts screaming and running towards Craig. She's screaming with her hands outstretched. Now instinct takes over for Craig, and he bends down on one knee and he puts his arms out ready to embrace her. And he tells the story that time slowed down at that moment. And all this training kicked in. He thought, I can't hug this kid, that's wildly inappropriate. That's in unprofessional contact. So he panicked and he stood up. And of course, in slow motion, she's still screaming towards him. And he realises, she's going to hug me anyway. And she's kind of belt buckle height. And this is really inappropriate. And so he panicked even more. And so he spun around. And he's standing in the quadrangle, and of course she buries her face in his backside, wraps her hands around him, and she's screaming, it really hurts. And he's standing there going, there. It's okay. I'm glad you're laughing, because it is a funny story, but it's a tragically sad story. It's a really sad story. I couldn't think of anything worse. Have we really come to that? Is that what we mean by a child-safe environment? If anyone could have been worse, I'm haunted by this image that it could have been worse if he ran away. If Craig ran, he was like, yeah, I love you, I care for you, but I'm protecting your professional space. It's funny, I told that story a couple of years ago to a group of our young adult volunteers on one of our Edmund Rice camps, and mostly 16, 17-year-olds. And when I said that's the worst it could have been, one of the guys shook his head. I said, what? And he goes, the whole time he was telling that story, I was so sure Craig was going to stiff-arm the kid and knock her over. You know the kind of 17-year-old I'm talking about. We all work with them. Apologies if you're in this room and you're 17. I'm sure you're not one of those 17-year-olds. Well, I was one of those 17-year-olds. I was that kind of guy that would make a comment like that. And I got involved in youth ministry at a very young age. And it transformed me and my understanding of who I'm called to be in this world, not just as a human being, but who I'm called to be as a disciple. And so another story that I guess I'd share with you about that is little Matty. And I was a stupid 17-year-old, and I had a great big mop of hair, so I want you to imagine that and cling on to that, because it's hard to imagine these days, but there's a few people nodding around the room, thank you. And and I remember my first day of camp, I met Matty, and he was an 8-year-old, beautiful, freckle face, innocent looking kid as they all are. We were trying to play volleyball, and I was trying to fit 12 kids onto one side of a court, and I was trying to get Timmy into the front line, and I put my hand on Matty's shoulder and said, Matty, can you just move over a little bit? Well, Matty exploded. Get your hand off me, you idiot, I'll get my dad's shotgun and shoot you in the head. And it was really real for Matty. It was really real. You'd see the look in his face. I was stopped to the core to think that an 8-year-old living in Perth with me, the same city as me, supporting the same footy team, whatever, that his life experience had taught him to have this personal space that was so big and needed to be defended so passionately. And it really reminded me that what we were trying to do was quite unique and quite powerful. We were trying to be present and life-giving in the lives of people who haven't always had that experience. And I think it gave me a great insight into what it was that the Christian brothers at the time were trying to do by running this program. In general, our model of youth ministry is got a dual emphasis. It's about their personal development and empowerment of young adults who are in our care in the youth ministry. But it's also about providing a service, a really mutually transformative and respectful service for young people who are ostracised or marginalised or diminished in some way. And we carry that dual emphasis right throughout. Over the course of the next few days, my relationship with Matty was fairly strained, and I haven't got time to go into all the details, but it's fairly nothing exciting about the relationship. But I remember pivotal moments when I offered him the last piece of fruit, and he sort of looked at it as if, have you spat on it? Was the look on his face. I remember we were making a kite and we were cutting out the template, and as I reached for the ruler, we both reached for the ruler at the same time, and our elbows bumped, and I was waiting for the shotgun talk, It didn't come. But what I also remember is that at the end of camp, when Matty was being picked up, he ran across the car park and wanted to introduce me to his dad. I was introduced to his dad. And as he said goodbye, he ran over and gave me this huge hug goodbye. And I couldn't believe the transformation, how far he'd come over the course of just 4 days. Now you've got to remember, I was 17 and I was an idiot. And remember, I had a full head of hair as well, don't forget that. And I thought I was blown away by this transformation. I was floating on cloud 9 for the rest of the day, and I thought I was pretty hot stuff. Did you guys see what I've done, what I've achieved, I must be pretty extraordinary. And of course, through part of our reflection and debriefing and discernment process, it just became really apparent to me that while the transformation was extraordinary, I hadn't done anything that was extraordinary in unto itself. I'd just been there. I'd just been a decent human being. I just hadn't been a really crap human being. And that in itself, for some people, is enough to be a really transformative relationship. We talk in our tradition about the values of presence, compassion and liberation. Now, I haven't got time to go into those, it's probably not appropriate. But it reminded me, I wanted to name that because that's what we're about. We're about life-giving youth ministry. And if we lose sight of that, I think we've lost already. And I think is what Teresa and Francis and others and church leaders are calling us to do, is to not lose sight of that. To say, sure, we want to demonstrate and bear witness to the new truth of what we're doing to prevent and injure and to minimise risk, but also what we're doing to continue to bring that life-giving ministry to others. It was really good that to see Teresa mention, sorry, I'm just walking around, I realise it's freaking out people with cameras when I move around, I apologise for that. I'll move back. It's really good that Teresa mentioned the Working with Children check. And I, like Teresa, and like most of us, would think that's a no-brainer. That's kind of the first port of call, that's just a mandatory thing. But unfortunately, obviously, we're still learning that. The drama with that is, and I use this as an example, and this is the full extent of my PowerPoint prowess, so prepare to be spellbound, is that nothing is perfect. Everything has holes in it, even the Working with Children check process. So we think it protects people from harm or injury or risk, but there are huge holes in even that. It just means you haven't been caught yet. That's all it means, okay? So it's really important that we as an organisation have a whole range of things that we do that are about screening and protection. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read that, and this is only a partial list of what our policies, practices, protocols and procedures are. But we have a whole range of things that what we would call screening and selection. And if you can make it through that, and if you can realise through your orientation that we are an open and transparent organisation, there is nothing we won't talk about. Now, research tells us that's one of the greatest protective things you can be, is to be able to publicly demonstrate that there's no sacred cows in your organisation. We are an open and transparent and accountable ministry. If you make it through that process, then you've got a whole range of steps to go through in terms of your preparation and training. And again, I won't go into the steps associated with those. But keeping in mind too, that this is not something that's done to our volunteers, it's done with our volunteers. We engage our volunteers in this process. We use the old reflective practice of reflected upon action and acted upon reflection. One constantly informing the other. We reflect upon the action and then we act upon that reflection. So by that stage, they're ready to actually go from personal development youth ministry into this service delivery model. But right throughout that process, we've got a very clear and public system and protocols and procedures about the way we supervise and about the way we debrief. The debrief is code for support, give feedback, nurture, evolve, constantly improve practice. And of course, you can't have any of that without what we would call the documentation and reporting systems. Everybody in our organisation needs to know what to do and when to do it and where to turn to for help. As Teresa was saying earlier, there's no point in having the checklist and the protocol if you don't know what to do with it and when to call on it. I could talk more about that. I think the last thing is that what I want to say is we've got to keep in mind why we do these things. We don't exist to comply with policy and protocol. It's crucial that we do. In fact, it's non-negotiable that we do in our world, and I think we should live up to that. But we exist to be proponents of life-giving ministry. And we need to keep that consciousness at all times. And we need to somehow keep it across everything we do, not just the fun bits. The last story, I know I'm probably over time, the last thing I'd add to that is, there's a great story, and I don't know if it's true. I hope it's true, and please don't look it up on Google and come up to me in the break and go, Snopes says that never actually happened. I like to think it's true, it's a nice story, and don't spoil it for me, I like to be in ignorance. There's a story that goes back to the 60s that in the United States, when the whole country was rallying behind John F. Kennedy's promise to put a human being on the moon before a certain date. They say that the leadership at NASA was so inspirational and transformational that everybody shared the common vision right across the board. And they say that what epitomised that the most was the day that somebody was visiting NASA, a very VIP, a very important person was coming, and the press gallery was arriving early. And as they were arriving early and setting up, there was a janitor, and the janitor was mopping the hallway with a mop and a bucket. And one of the press gallery turned to this person and said, "What are you doing?" And I think they meant it as a, "What are you doing? You shouldn't be here. Don't you know you're not a very important person?" And they said, "What are you doing?" And the janitor looked up with a great big smile and said, "Don't you know? Haven't you heard? I'm putting a person on the moon." And I love that story, to think that right down in the moment of mopping that hallway, that was part of putting a person on the moon. We're doing amazing things in youth ministry. We're transforming lives. And it's really important that we keep track of that. We're transforming our own lives and liberating ourselves from our own prejudices and stereotypes, as well as supporting other young people that we may come into contact with. So when we're stuck filling out checklists and protocols and forms and conducting a policy audit, it's really important that when you're hunched over that table late at night and someone says, "What are you doing?" that you say, "Hey, haven't you heard? We're transforming lives. We're putting a person on the moon." It's wonderful work that we do, and I think it's important that you continue to do it and bear witness to the new truth. I wish you all the best. Thank you.